So this morning, as so many of our brothers and sisters in this country and Cuba and Canada and the DR uh, are dealing with the aftermath or the advancing um, threat of hurricanes, I thought this prayer for those in time of disaster is appropriate. So let us pray. Holy One, you are our comfort and strength in times of sudden disaster, crisis, or chaos. Surround us now with your grace and peace through storm or earthquake, fire or flood. By your Spirit, lift up those who have fallen, sustain those who work to rescue or rebuild, and fill us with the hope of your new creation. Through you, our rock and redeemer. Amen.
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 Oh, we hold up all who are evacuating and on the road, and this is a big honkin' storm coming. Um, so, good morning to all. And we did not meet last week because I thank you for your understanding as I slipped off to the cathedral to be present for a service of Thanksgiving for the life of the Queen, which it was a beautiful service. And it is available online if anyone wants to see it. The presiding bishop was in rare form, as he always is. Um, and the music was spectacular. And it was just a really special time to be there. So thank you for indulging me as I went. So just for Hangjin's edification and how we proceed, we move rather deliberately, shall I say, through scripture. And so we try to read a chapter. If we're really lucky, we get two, or on a really good day, we get three chapters read. Um, at a time, what we've been doing with Job, because Job is essentially a series of monologues, of speeches back and forth between different characters. We've been having one person read a whole speech through, and then we go back and we talk about, what strikes us, what do we hear, what questions do we have, and then it's sort of just a free for all conversation. So jump in as you feel the spirit leads you, and there are no wrong answers, there are no dumb questions. We are all doing this together, and that's what makes it fun. So let me just say this, that last time we read chapters 28 through 30. And I thought we would go back and just look at 30 again very quickly to make sure that there wasn't anything that we left, any stones we left unturned before we move on. But just to locate us in the book of Job, we are today we'll be finishing Job's final defense speech. So Job, has been suffering. He is an upright and righteous man, and he has, Fred will tell you he has suffered boils, he's lost his children, all of his wealth has been taken away. And his three friends, and we use that term rather lightly, um, keep telling him, well, you must have done something wrong because this wouldn't have happened. God is just, and this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done something wrong. Job also believes that things happen, according to our deeds, but he keeps defending himself and saying, but I haven't done anything. So this is the essential problem. And so today, as we read chapter 31, he's sort of closing his case and he's resting his defense. So we will hear that. So that's where we are. Let me just do this. And so as part of this final defense that Job makes, last time we read chapter 30. I don't know that we need to read it out loud again. I'm just wondering if anybody wanted to revisit anything or wanted to just maybe summarize in a sentence or two what we talked about last time as we launch into chapter 31. Anyone, anyone? All right, I hear nothing, so I'm going to say let's move on to chapter 31, which I think you'll find interesting. Um, oops, sorry about that. The other thing I should say about the way we do Bible study is that I project the New Revised Standard Version um, on the screen, and folks on the call are using a variety of translations, which is wonderful because it's really helpful. The Hebrew of Job is very difficult to, and there are lots of, it's ambiguous in places. And so there are lots of nuanced translations. And so, we go back and we look at the Hebrew words and we struggle with them as best we can. But one of the most interesting things I think that we do is when we compare, well, my translation says this, well, mine says that. And then we try to struggle through and figure out, well, why does that matter? What are some of the ambiguities? What do we think? And that's where it's fun. So, all right, so here Job is wrapping up his defense. Would someone like to read chapter 31? Maybe someone who hasn't had a chance to read in a while, and conclude his defense speech. I'm looking at you, Mr. Attorney. John, would you want to read this for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look upon a virgin? What would be my portion from God above, and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Does not calamity befall the unrighteous, and disaster the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, and my fault has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has followed my eyes, and if any spot has clung to my hands, then let me sow, and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, and I have lain in wait in my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let another man kneel over her. For that would be a heinous crime. That would be a criminal offense. For that would be a fire consuming down to Abaddon, and it would burn to the root all my harvest. If I have rejected the cause of my male or female slaves when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb? If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not eaten from it. For from my youth I reared the orphan like a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, whose loins have not blessed me? Who has not warmed with the fleece of my sheep? If I have raised my hand against the orphan, because I saw I had supporters at the gate, then let my shoulder blades fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken in its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. If I have made good my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, or because my hand had gotten much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I should have been false to God above. If I have rejoiced at the ruin of those who hated me, or exulted when the evil overtook them, I have not let my mouth sin by asking for their lives with a curse. If those in my tent ever said, oh, that we might be sated with his flesh, the stranger has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. If I have concealed my transgressions as others do, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I stood in great fear of the multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, so that I kept silence and did not go out of doors. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. My land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together. If I have eaten its yield without payment and caused the death of its owners, let thorns grow instead of wheat, and foul weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended.
Thank you. It's quite a feat. What do you hear in this speech, in Job's final defense? Is there anything new that we haven't heard before?
Covering all the bases.
Yeah.
I was a little struck. I missed last week when we did 30. In 30, there was a lot of you turned cruel to me,
Yes.
you lifted me up on the wind, and all that stuff. He's now shifted back to God as a third person, as the Almighty, and someone he's appealing to, and it's not so personal now in his response.
Excellent. Yes.
Interesting, but maybe not significant at verse 23, that he's talking about having done all of these things out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. Let's look at the Hebrew there. 23. For calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty, I can do nothing.
Oh, that's different.
It is different. And the Hebrew word that we have translated as terror means terror or dread or object of terror. So, okay, so that's not so nuanced. Yeah, and that's a great example of, Hebrew is much harder to parse than Greek is. And so there are so many different permutations, and it's been so long since I took Hebrew, that it's very, there are different ways to read the same phrase, and it makes a huge difference the way it's rendered. Well, what about these first 12 verses? I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look upon a virgin? What would be my portion from God above, and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Does not calamity befall the unrighteous? This is what we've been talking about for 31 verses, for 31 chapters. Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? And before, of course, Job has said that he felt like God was, watching him around a corner, waiting for him to trip up. If I've walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. And then he goes on at 9, if my heart has been enticed by a woman and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another and let other men kneel over her. Now, I thought you all were just going to jump on that. What do you hear here?
Maybe with tongs, but not.
There's an assumption of monogamy here that was
Mhm.
not present in,
Beautiful. Yep,
Mhm.
exactly. So yeah.
you know,
And
Solomon had 500 wives, Abraham, this was just the accepted. If you were
definitely.
rich, that was one of the perks.
And that was one of your status, one of the signs of your status, right? Was
Mhm.
Yes.
was all of your wives. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
My
And
study Bible has a salacious note that the verb grind has sexual overtones, as the parallel kneel over shows.
yes, that's kind of what I thought people would jump on. Uh
The
let's
New
look at
International Version is more explicit than "May my wife grind another man's grain, and may other men sleep with her."
Mhm.
So they're not.
grind another man's grain. There you go.
Yeah, but I mean, they're also may other men sleep with her,
Right.
Mhm.
for that would have been wicked a sin to be judged.
Yeah, I think we
So
probably read this euphemistically. Um, yeah. But back to what Fred was saying before, this is assuming monogamy, which is kind of anachronistic here, right? And even though we believe that Job was written late, it's meant to take place early. It's meant to sort of be part of the prehistory, that mythology, in the same vein as Noah and the Tower of Babel and all that. So this idea of monogamy, it ought to strike us as kind of out of place.
Mhm.
Were you going
we
to
have
say
a
something,
reason
Donna?
why it would be there then.
Well, let's figure that out. Donna, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, to me, it seems like the a notable thing is that, I mean, he seems to be going through a catalog of all possible sins and finding himself innocent of them. And what's notable to me is that he seems to live in a universe where his knowledge is complete. And he doesn't seem to be able to imagine anything he's done outside of this catalog that he's been brought up on and tutored in.
That I think is really helpful because there, it does assume that Job knows everything that he has done,
Mhm.
everything that would be expected, and that, he's never misstepped accidentally, um, or, inadvertently. And maybe he hasn't, but I think it's worth paying attention to that and asking ourselves the old, English class question: is Job a reliable narrator? Can we take his version of events at face value? I don't know.
I think it's more than that. You're asking, it's like asking if you believe you're in a meritocracy to the country club.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're all going to look around and say, "Yes, I deserve this."
Exactly. Well,
And
that's really what I'm saying when I say, is he a reliable narrator? Can his self-knowledge or self-awareness or self-report be trusted by us? Is he so skewed? And that's a great example at the country club. Of course, I deserve this. Of course, this um, is a reflection of my goodness. Yeah. So I wonder if Job can be trusted as a narrator. I'm
well,
not
you'd have
saying
to
he's
think.
intentionally deluding anybody, but can any of us be? I guess that's really the question that Donna's raising: is can any of us present a complete and objective report about ourselves? I'm sorry, Fred. What were you going to say?
I forget.
I'm sorry.
No, no,
If it comes back, let me know. What else do you hear here?
I don't get the idea that the reader is supposed to regard this with an irony, though. I mean, I feel as though it's kind of straight up presented, and that he's a real Boy Scout, and that he's gone through everything in his mind, and he passed all the tests, and there weren't any red flags, and that's how we're supposed to take him. That he's the upright, righteous man, and this calamity did fall upon him, and now what?
I guess my question, going back to what you said before, Donna, is any of us fully upright and righteous? Even the best Boy Scout among us is, I mean, present company excluded, of course, but thinking about others. But you know, like it's like doing our own background check. Well, no, I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. I wonder, you know, is there something? And it doesn't mean that he deserves this horrible fate that has befallen him. He does not deserve that. I think, you know, we can agree on that. And at the same time, is he this blameless, spotless specimen that you know, he would have us believe? And I think he believes that he is. Again, I don't think he's trying to pull one over on us. I'm just always a little bit skeptical. Come on, no one's that good. So
I'm thinking of Jimmy Carter when he admitted that he had lusted in his
yes,
heart.
I thought the same thing, Fred. Exactly.
You know, I mean, everybody does, or even today, the some of the Jewish sects up in New York have put things over their glasses so that they can't see more than 18 inches away from them with any detail to keep them from, you know, and you know, I just think that's the problem is in your head. It's not in the it's not in what's outside your head. And for him to claim complete control over what's in his head is perhaps unreasonable.
That's kind of what I'm thinking too. It's so funny you mentioned Jimmy Carter though, because this week it's the first thing I thought of. Exactly. Because, you know, compared to what came after Jimmy Carter, I shouldn't say what, who came after Jimmy Carter and the stories that came out in the decades since, you know, him lusting.
What isn't a bad description of some of the more recent?
Well, I try not to call people what's. But you know the revelations. You know, Jimmy Carter lusting in his heart seems pretty tame, and yet you know
Pretty honest, yeah.
exactly pretty human, right? Because that's hello. I would wonder about someone, you know.
I think another thought kind of was forming as in the context of this is the week of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur coming up, and our own practices of self-examination, confession, repentance, and you know, how reliable narrators are we, or anybody? And if we're not, then what? And does it matter if he is a reliable narrator?
Right.
I think we're bringing our modern awareness to this, and we're kind of psychologizing, but I don't know, to me it's more like a fable, and then we just accept it on its face.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we already have the beginning already gave us, you know, the the skinny on Job. He's an upright man who had no sin. So, you know, he's reiterating that, but I think we have to accept what we were told in the beginning if we're gonna, you know.
Sure, the premise is the whole premise of this story is based on that, right? But and you know, it's worth asking ourselves. And of course, yes, this is a fable. This is mythological in the sense of those prehistoric stories. Just like most of us probably don't take the story of Noah literally or Adam and Eve literally. I know some do, but most probably don't. I don't think that we can take this literally either. And yet, what is there for us to take away? Because that's really the interest. Otherwise, this is just a literary exercise, right? And it's interesting, but it's not spiritually or theologically informative. So the question that's why I asked this question is like, okay, so when we confess, to Ray's point, when we confess, do we name everything? Well, probably not. And it's worth just using this as almost a Rorschach or a litmus test to do some self reflection. That's why I asked that. Because how many of us say, well, I haven't done anything wrong? I've had people say to me before, well, I don't understand why we have the general confession because, you know, I didn't I didn't do anything bad this week. Well, good for you. That's great. um, so anyway, um, anything else here that is interesting to you, or so what ethic does this presume, the way that Job is presenting his own uprightness? So Fred talked about monogamy. What else does this assume here?
He takes care of orphans, he takes care of widows, he's good to his servants,
I'd like to ask the servants about that.
Yeah,
all
right.
sorts of things.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent.
It's
Well, I guess
almost, I'm thinking about the fact that he doesn't lust after. I mean, obviously he had a little lust because that's why he got married in the first place.
And had all those kids.
And then just to assume that it extinguished itself for everybody else in the world is I mean, Jimmy Carter was, being honest. Always a
This
terrible thing for a politician to have to admit to.
Yeah.
I read this. I have trouble as I read this. I'm retrojecting or interjecting, what we talk about from the New Testament of God's grace and how we need all that. And I mean, so some of it is, to me, is looking at it from nobody can justify is that good. Nobody can we need God's grace. We all are sinners someplace. And yet Job thinks he can justify himself in every which way.
again, John, I was going to say it brings back to mind a point we've looked at before was, and the general confession language now is not all about individual sin. You can get a buy on whatever you haven't done or done individually, but we are still wrapped up in collective evil of various kinds, wars, social injustice of various kinds. I think that's a modern understanding, but it also could be a background here. I mean, this story of personal rectitude over and against evil in the world, it does happen. It happens to others too.
Well, I think you also have to remember that, Job, at the beginning, they had a way to wipe out sin too. You sacrificed.
And remember, Job sacrificed just in case. Remember, he
yes,
and he sacrificed for his children.
Yep, just in case they had done anything, just to cover them. Yep.
Just to I don't know how you sacrifice, for something you don't know that you've done wrong, but it is, in that respect, he was rather like the general confession, and he was absolved of it in his mind.
In his mind.
I just wanted to go back to what John said because I thought that was so helpful. We can't help ourselves, right? For those of us who are Christian, who have been formed by a relationship with Jesus and are still developing that relationship, God willing, for me, it would be impossible to read this without that lens. And so I'm so glad you said that, John, because we are products of our own spiritual context and our own relationship with Jesus and our understanding of God's grace. And thanks be to God for that. And so I just think it's worth thinking. So I'm glad you did that. It's interesting too, when we were talking about the ethic that's assumed here. So monogamy and caring for widows and orphans and treating your servants well. Then he goes on, if I have made gold my trust or called fine gold my confidence, if I'd rejoiced because my wealth was great or because my hand had gotten much, so again, it assumes some humility and the opposite of the meritocracy, that no, I don't necessarily deserve this. So that's also interesting to me, the way he phrases that. This also would be iniquity to be punished by the judges. For I should have been false to God above. So to Job, being true to God is understanding that, doesn't make you a better person because you are wealthy, which is kind of countercultural too, because we've talked about that before, that in this system, if you were very wealthy and successful, then that was an outward sign of having been blessed by God. And so it's like he's calling into that, calling that into
Just
question.
like the Puritans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that theology, God controlled every single thing that happened and weighed it on the scales. And, that's what makes this such a difficult, for Job
Mm-hmm.
and for his comforter. His comforters are willing to assume he's guilty because God is punishing him and he knows better than they do.
And it doesn't compute. I mean, it's outside of their ability to conceive of something happening randomly or, yeah, just because. So if A, then B, if this happened, then there must have been a root cause for it. Absolutely. So this upsets the whole understanding of how God and the universe work, really.
Their theology does not allow this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what about our theology? What do you all think? Is this how it works?
Their theology was based on a very limited understanding of the physical world.
Mm-hmm. So what about us?
We have a bigger understanding, and I think the idea that God is there weighing things and all that is a misreading of what Jesus was saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, we can't help but read through Jesus, right? Exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, from a Christian's perspective, reading this.
Yep.
And at the risk of irritating Ray, I'll reiterate that I sometimes call myself a Budeo-Christian.
We didn't know
that. Ray is
39 minutes today.
But they have a much more, a much better explanation, which is bad things happen.
Yeah.
It's not God's fault.
It just is. That's just the way it goes. Yeah.
I don't recall anything in the New Testament, and with my leaky mind, I perhaps am omitting something, but I don't recall anything that says that bad things don't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Or bad things don't happen to good people. Nothing that I can recall.
But there is a balance in God is supposed to balance things out. If not in this world, then the next.
He balances it the other way, because the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And those who got their rewards here on earth, you aren't going to get them in heaven. So he's flipped it entirely.
And that was the gospel last Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
You can get it now, you can get it later. But the idea that everything is balanced out nicely is baked into the theology.
And, well, Tuppers,
Yeah, I wanted to pause. Hello, Bob and Ellie. Where are you?
We just arrived in Munich, raced to the room and plugged in.
Oh, we are
Okay, right.
blessed by your presence. Oh,
Well, it's nice to see you all and to speak English.
I hope you are having the time of
Yeah,
your life.
what she said.
I hope you are just having the best time. I'm so happy for you.
Oh, this is great. I'm sorry to butt in.
Not at all.
No.
Not at all. We are
You were
so
called
glad
out, as I
you're
remember, for when you arrived.
here. What,
Thanks.
so
Continue.
just going back to that question about, in the New Testament, it doesn't say that bad things don't happen to good people. Think about, and we've talked about this before, that scene, oh, here comes Kim, yay. That scene in John's gospel, right? Where the man born blind is brought to Jesus, and the assumption is that somebody had to have sinned, either the man himself or his parents. And Jesus, just explodes that. And so, I think that's a good um, interlocutor with this because it just, we've been fed and, raised and fed on this notion that, yes, it does happen and God's grace, thanks be to God for God's grace and mercy um, in the face of all of suffering. Hey,
I
Kim.
have to. Oh,
Oh,
I have to disagree with you, Patty. That and when the blind man is brought, Jesus does give a reason that makes it part of God's plan that he was
mhm.
born blind.
But he doesn't say that it's because he sinned. That's my
No,
point. The
but he gives
question,
a reason. God had a reason, and there is that you know theme in a lot of Christian thought that everything that happens, is because God or the devil. Sometimes I had a woman on the my bike ride who said that Satan put a hole in her air mattress. But
very
there is.
specific.
Remember that anecdote.
She was entire. I mean, I swear she was entirely serious.
Oh, I'm sure she was.
But
Just to
Yeah.
test you.
there is that theme. Whereas there are in other spiritual disciplines that will remain unmentioned.
Thank you.
There is the idea that bad things happen and you cannot stop them. You can only deal with what you control is how you deal with them.
Right. And without going back to our study of the Gospel of John, I'll just say remember that in John's Gospel, these scenes are presented so that, it's always about the so that God's grace can be demonstrated and power can be demonstrated through them. But what it doesn't say is that, oh, yeah, this guy did something horrible. He was lusting after his neighbor's wife. That's why, so, yes, God works through and we can discuss separately does God do it so that God can work through? I don't know, but my point was that it wasn't about human sin.
Yeah.
And that's the frame of reference with which we Christians approach this idea. um so anything else? So Ellie, we had this Jimmy Carter moment at the beginning. Both Fred and I read this as and remembered Jimmy Carter lusting in his heart. This is Job's final speech, his final defense. He's about to rest his case at the end of this speech, and maybe all of us will sigh, will breathe a sigh of relief and say enough. Um, but he begins with, I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look upon a virgin? And he talks about, if he had been enticed by a woman and lain in wait at his neighbor's door. And then there was this phrase that some of us enjoyed. Then let my wife grind for another and let other men kneel over her. Um, so this whole idea about sexual faithfulness, which would have been anachronistic at this time. And we talked about that
Yeah.
as well. Um, but then he goes on to talk about, other things he hasn't done. He hasn't rejected the cause of his slaves. He hasn't neglected the poor and the widow and the orphan. So, he he's making his case that he's done it all right.
Uh-huh.
But he's not doing it. He never claims he's doing it because he wants to do it, or he claims, that he's doing it out of fear of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
which I
thanks.
think
Thanks
is a
for
different perspective than Christians should have.
Yeah, what's going on in his heart? That's a great point. Ellie, what were you going to say?
I'm saying thanks for scrolling through this. I'm in a Marian, so they've got the Book of Mormon in English and the New Testament, and only the New Testament in 3 other languages. So I wasn't able to look this up.
It was a long trip. You could have memorized this verse. Or chapter, I guess.
So what about the point that Fred just made, which I think is really interesting? He's doing this and he says, calamity, however, I might be getting it backwards. Terror of the Lord causes me calamity. He's upholding this ethic out of fear, out of terror, out of concern about judgment. What about his motivation, his heart, his desire? Does that matter? Again, that may be anachronistic, but it's a good way for us to think about what matters to us, stepping away from Job for a second. Does it matter what our motivations are?
Well, the ethical.
I think it is important.
Kim,
Sorry, go ahead.
Could you say that again? Kim, you kind of broke up a bit. Could you say it again?
I think that intent is very important. And I think that's now I just came in when you were reading the scripture, so I didn't get in on the beginning part of it. But just generally speaking, I think that what's in our heart is extremely important. If mistakes are made or something like that, there are things done with malice, and there are things done that are, I don't know, maybe ignorant or insensitive, or they're just learning. Maybe we don't know. But I do think that intent is very important. Whether there's intent or, what the intent is.
I was going to say, there couldn't be ethical humanism if there weren't people who felt that there was some sort of conscientious imperative that they have on their own, out of their own experience of the world and their own conscience.
Good point.
Patty, you're probably a relevant expert in this. Was intent important in the early Jewish faith, or was it enough that you just followed the rules?
It's a great question. I'm not sure how much intent played into it.
I do believe that in Christianity, intent is more important. That Jesus brought that message of kind of like the heart and the love. And I think that Judaism is very, very just action-based. It's very rote prescription of how to act and not act. You know what I mean? So I do think that Christianity, the intent is more important.
What comes out of a man's mouth is more sin than what goes into it.
And Kim, you would know better than I, but my sense is that modern day Judaism does have more concern with intent. I'm thinking about in Yom Kippur, in seeking forgiveness from the one harmed, right?
I think there's a lot about ethics too. Like there's like these ethical societies with Jews, and they do care very much about being part of their communities and doing certain things and like goodness and things like that. So I do think it is. But I think in these early days, right, like Old Testament days, I feel like everything was about action plans, and then suddenly it was like, wait, this isn't quite working out. We need to build in this sort of something a little more heartfelt and less rote. I don't know. I feel like that was Jesus's message.
There was.
And if you love, then everything follows. All the actions follow. Jesus just tried to simplify it. Of these commandments, the most important is love. Everything else will follow.
What were you going to say, Fred?
I was going to say that in the Psalms, there is a lot about love, loving the Lord, or, being close to him. So it's not totally absent in the Old Testament. It just, certainly the Jews, the early Jews, Leviticus, the purity codes, they had so many rules, no one could follow them all.
Absolutely.
And the Pharisees, were a reaction to that. We just follow the rules. And we don't know why we're following them. We don't know what God meant when he said, don't eat the lobster, but we're gonna follow him.
It's a because I said so ethic, right?
Yeah, we're gonna get that later on in a couple of chapters too.
Yep. What were you gonna say, Ray? I'm sorry.
For the passing thought that has left the station. So
okay, when it comes back, it happens.
It's a circular track, I find.
Exactly, it happens to all of us. Anything else? How about this? Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Does Job have one to hear him? Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. And I'm reminded of Deuteronomy when, the Lord prescribes, putting the word of the Lord on your doorposts, on your lintel. So, if there's this indictment, I would carry it, bind it on myself. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. But it sounds as though, he has not gotten this indictment. And it's very vague to him.
I am struck, mine does not say adversary. Mine says, let my accuser. But in the beginning.
Which verse is that?
We're talking about 35.
Okay, I just want to look it up in the Hebrew while you're talking.
Yeah, I'm thinking that, the adversary was the original, Satan who started all this.
Yep.
So this is saying adversary in a general, but the translation you use could be linked directly to Satan.
Definitely. And remember that Hasatan, the Hebrew word for Satan, means the accuser. Here it's strife, controversy, dispute. It's sort of like the one with whom you're wrestling, your opponent. So Fred, you said that your translation says accuser.
Accuser, yes.
Yeah, and that's much closer to that idea of Satan for sure. Yep. Well, what do you all think about the fact that the words of Job are ended? Has he made his case in these 31 chapters? Understanding he hasn't spoken the whole time, but most of it.
We've had 4 people, and they all have the exact same theology.
Mm-hmm. But what has Job made his case? That's my question.
He presented no evidence.
Yeah.
Would have been nice if he had brought a servant in to say, yes, Job is a good master and pays me fairly.
Hasn't declared bankruptcy 6 times.
Yeah.
Again, and so again, that's what I'm getting at when I say, is he the most reliable self-reporter? Because you're right, we're taking his word at face value.
But we have it at the beginning that he is an upright man, and therefore probably doesn't lie intentionally.
God says it himself. God said so himself.
Yeah.
Too bad
God
that Job
looked
didn't
at him
hear him.
and said, you know, "Hey, my servant Job, you know, he does everything right."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's contradictory.
It is contradictory. Did you want to say anything else about that, Elin?
No, I have a lot of difficulty with the contradictions, and let's put it that way. You know, that he's tried his best. What's the point of trying?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Great question. What do you all think about that? What is the point of trying if Job has been so upright and done everything he's supposed to do and not done things he's not supposed to do, and this still happens to him? What's the point? Should he just give up?
Well, there's the gift of a clear conscience.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
His wife
Not
says
small.
he should just curse God and die.
And cursing, the result of cursing God is dying. I don't
No,
follow
she didn't
that
really say
necessarily.
that, but I think it's a given, you know, if you,
Yeah. Or just
I
give
mean,
up.
you could adopt a new theology.
Then you'd have to find a new God.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if this is God, you know, I would be, and Ray says you can't do it, but the
And
prodigal
I'm an
son,
authority.
the parody of the prodigal son says you can walk away from the relationship. Besides which, you know,
But
one of
that's
the
that's a Jesus statement.
yeah,
Uh,
but we're,
You can walk, and see, that's the gift of free will, right? You can walk away, and what happens? He comes back. He chooses to come back because he realizes that he needs to come back, and he's welcome back.
but the
Um,
father does not come chase him down and say you have to,
That's free will.
we
Exactly.
have to have this relationship.
He does not go out and, lasso him and drag him back home. No, not at all. He gives him the space. He lets him, and how hurtful, not to go down this path totally about the prodigal son, but just imagine how painful that had to have been for the father, because essentially what the son was saying is, I want you dead. The only way
Yeah.
he would get his share of the inheritance is if his father was
You
gone.
are dead to me.
Right. And so, and still his father welcomes him home. But that's the gift of free will, the gift to be able, not to be forced, compelled to be in relationship.
But one
Um,
of the signatures of an abusive relationship is where you're not allowed to leave.
right.
But free will does not seem to have been a thing at the stage when Job was written.
Well,
But
I
it
don't
was.
know. I'm thinking about Genesis. I'm thinking about the Garden of Eden.
Oh, that's true.
Which is some people, that's another story for another day about, well, why would we get set up that, given this choice, and when we know we were going to fail.
And
Um,
Job does have the free will. He can curse God.
exactly.
Well, he can do a lot of these other things too. I mean, it's just gone through a catalog of things he has done and not done that point to his efforts to be a good person. And by contrast, I mean, the fact that he has done those things and claims them implies to me that he could have chosen not to do them. He could have exploited his slaves. He could have left the orphan hungry and so forth. And he's chosen not to do that.
And I think this only works if that choice is legitimate, right? Because if he doesn't have a choice, then he doesn't have a defense, right?
What's he been rewarded for?
Yeah, you can't say, well, I've been so upright and noble if you didn't have a choice. So there always has to be that opportunity to make the other choice. I think that's a really valid point.
Although we then come back to his motive where he says, I did all this stuff and I was upright out of terror of calamity from God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
That curdles it.
That's a great word. Yeah, it does kind of curdle it.
Did it back then, though. Back then, you were supposed to obey the rules. You
Yep.
didn't eat shrimp.
Because I
Why?
said so.
Nobody knows. But you still didn't eat the shrimp because of some moral objection. You didn't eat them because God said don't eat shrimp.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I love that. Nobody knows. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And obeying God's will was enough, I think, back then.
Well,
That's all they expected.
and so you just touched on something that I was just thinking about. Would it be easier in your mind to have the rule book and say, okay, nope, didn't do this, didn't do this, didn't do this, as opposed to this ethic of love your neighbor as yourself, love your Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is harder?
Definitely the love thy neighbor.
I think so too. I think so too.
I mean, the way of Jesus is really difficult.
It's that narrow way, right? Because it expects a lot.
It's also dynamic, which makes it more difficult. It's like being on a balance board at the gym, and you never know, whether you have to be constantly aware of the circumstances to know whether you're doing well or not, and doing the right thing. And you have to keep questioning, I think. Maybe the balance board isn't the best, but it seems to me it's a dynamic. The love your neighbor is a dynamic, and is it ever enough? Am I doing enough? To me, it calls for constant question, which is not a threat. It's just a living in awareness.
To obey all the rules are conscious acts. They're part of your consciousness. To love your neighbor, to do the things that some of the spiritual disciplines require, really means your consciousness has to train your subconscious. To love your neighbor, you have to react that way. Just like you react to when you put your hand on a hot stove and you pull it back before you even know it's hot. If you're loving someone, your reaction is going to be not from your conscious decision, but from your unconscious, from your subconscious.
I like that. And I think that's what formation comes down to, right? It's building up. I used to describe it as sort of building up the trust muscle, but you could fill in that blank. It doesn't have to be trust, but it's practice. And as you said, Fred, with spiritual disciplines, that it becomes so innate that informs how you respond. And that really is what formation is. And I think that's why, in the past few decades, the church has moved from this whole idea of Christian education, which implies, opening the head with a can opener and pouring in information, as opposed to formation, which comes from the inside out, helping to shape who we are, which is a very different approach. I prefer formation to education any day.
I think I don't know whether this is a partial disagreement and partial endorsement. I think that even with all of the training of the subconscious and strengthening the trust reflexes, there is a level beyond that, I think, where it is perhaps a Zen phenomenon, Fred, of understanding the connectedness that we all have with each other and with creation, and operating out of that rather than more than reflexively. If you hurt, I hurt, and not because I think about it. Yes. But just because we know we are connected, we feel we are connected. It's it's a kind of a new agey thing that I'm partially uncomfortable with and partially convinced by.
Yes. Amen. And I think that is about spiritual maturity too, that the deeper we go and the more we are willing to allow ourselves to be formed and shaped, when we get to that, we have those glimpses. And I think that's God's grace. When we have those moments, I can tell you for me, I have these transcendent moments where I feel that connectedness, the kumbaya moment. And then boom, and, the next minute I'm cursing at the person cutting me off on the highway. Did that just this morning, and I thought, man, oh man, because I woke up and I was feeling like one with God, and then get me on 395 and it all goes out the window. And so that's the human experience, I can tell you.
Ride your bike, Patty.
Take my life in my hands.
She wouldn't make it.
Anyway, I know we are over time, but this was well worth, thinking about not only what Job says, and how do we read it as in our 21st century. Sorry, I cut off a whole 100 years there. 21st century sensibility as Christians, who are struggling to figure it out. I mean, we're until this side of the grave, we are always going to be wrestling with these things. And so being able to have these conversations and try different things on for size is so helpful as we clarify how we understand God and what our own motivations are. And so, yes, Job, fable, mythology, thousands of years ago, and great, great Rorschach for us to think about our own relationship with God. So Job has rested his defense, and so we will move on next week with chapter 32. And where will you be next week, Ellie?
I think Salzburg. And I might.
Oh, beautiful.
Where
might not be racing around quite so crazily.
Where have you been thus far in your?
Let's see. We landed in Frankfurt and we went to Utrecht for the first few days. Well, Bonn for a night, and then Utrecht for a few days, just to get a little bit of non-Germany into the trip, and then Mannheim, and we were in Stuttgart for a few days just before this. There's a giant folk fest there, which is kind of a contrast or an alternative or something to Oktoberfest, and it's quite a show. They've got a huge carny area, and it's pretty phenomenal. So we're going, but we're here for 5 days, so we'll just sort of dip our toe into the Oktoberfest a couple of times, maybe.
Well, I think we're going to go to the Hofbrauhaus and.
Well, it's interesting to see. We're hoping to sort of mooch around Munich a little and see what everybody else is doing while the Oktoberfest is going on. We will have a couple of evenings with the full effect, but it's very different from when it was when we were first traveling. It used to be everybody had the Oompa music and Blas music, and everybody was wearing, all the bands were wearing dirndls and lederhosen and whatnot. Now it's all the kids, and it's popular German songs, but they all know the words, and they're still wearing their dirndls and their pretty stuff, and standing on the benches and singing at the tops of their lungs. We kind of sort of sit at the side now. We don't get into the Oompa thing anymore.
I mean, you're not going to dance on the tables? You're not dancing on the tables?
I will not dance on the table. I
want to see pictures of that.
I can probably send you a couple. It's been quite a show.
Oh.
Well, you have your dirndl, and
I do. I have a dirndl. I bought a dirndl when I was much younger and much smaller. I can't wear it anymore. But yeah, but there's so many of them. It's all the young kids now. I mean, the 20 to 30 groups are in there partying like there's no tomorrow, and it's Sunday evening. So it's 80 to 90s German language rock.
Fascinating.
Well, some of the songs are American, but a lot of them are just the whatever the pop music is these days in Germany. And you have never lived until you tried to make sense out of German reggae.
My brain can't compute that.
I know, I can't either. I just
Oh, I love living vicariously through you guys. This is wonderful. Oh, Hong Jen, thank you for joining us this morning. Nancy, thank you for extending the invitation. Fabulous that you're here. I hope you will come back.
Thank you.
We are so delighted that you were here. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And I hope to see most of you on Sunday when Bishop Marianne is with us. We look forward to a delightful day. So thank you.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank
All right,
you.
bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Be
Bye.
well.
Thanks, everybody. It's
Thank
wonderful.
you.